Well, today I'm standing in front of some of our goldfish, and although at first this isn't going to seem like much of a quote-unquote homestead video, we're going to kind of take you through the steps of making your own fish food to feed some of your aquaponic type endeavors on the homestead. So as I watch these guys swim around, this is a large IBC tote that we've used for water collection, and I think before we get into the meat and potatoes of this as far as making your own fish food and sort of why that might be a good starting point and just a whole bunch of other thoughts that go along with that, I'm going to sort of say what the purpose of these fish is, because I think at face value it's kind of like, well, this is a homesteading channel, what are we talking about goldfish for? Goldfish have a long history of association with humans, and essentially the biggest reason we have these is because this IBC tote is for water collection. We don't want a million mosquitoes. So there's the first purpose. They are mosquito control, which they do exceptionally well. Number two, even though this is not a proper aquaponics system because it's all manual labor that uses it or makes it work, we basically do use this water, and right now we've just had a lot of rain, so this is full. And they're quite happy, but we do use this water for watering the garden. So the goldfish do, as any other kind of aquaponic system that's a little more advanced than this, the goldfish do input nutrients. And so what we are doing right now is, because we don't want to sort of go through all this water too quickly, we're just scooping out of this, and we're fortunate to live in an area that gets enough rain that we can sort of do that without being a recirculating system. It's working decently because we don't have a high stocking density here. And the third purpose is some of these individuals and some other fish that we have on the homestead, or at least the plan with them, is to incorporate them into the diet of some of our other livestock, primarily chickens. And so we're going to kind of run through a way to feed some of these animals that won't break your bank. So of course this is really a discussion on some pretty small species that are omnivorous. I think one of the big things, if you're looking at creating your own food, this is kind of something you're going to see us talk about again. It's a trophic level thing. Essentially in nature, and your homestead's no different, energy transfers sort of up the trophic levels, right? So at the bottom of the trophic level is your plants, because they're your primary producers. But then you go all the way up through different animal clads to the top, which essentially humans sit at the top because we consume a huge variety of all sorts of different things. So a lot of these fish that you're going to see us talk about, and the food that we're feeding them, is really geared towards sort of lower on the food chain, i.e. a lot of these are omnivores or heavy on the herbivory side of things. And that's what makes this homemade fish food work so well, I guess. If you were to use species such as trout or something that's more carnivorous, you'd definitely have to adapt it, and you would definitely see that creating such food is going to be a little more difficult for you because you're going to need the higher protein inputs. So this is kind of an odd sounding project, but when you have a garden, you do have a lot of things that maybe you can't use yourself super well, and this is something that we're finding raising the fish. And I know we're talking about goldfish and guppies right now and other smaller fish, but hypothetically this could be scaled up to essentially produce fish food for basically free. What I basically do is I steam everything first. So I do cut some of the vegetables up into a little bit smaller chunks just to make that process easier, and I usually start with some of the bigger, tougher things first and let them steam longer. So I'm going to kind of show you some examples of what you can use in this fish food. So this is a pretty good example right here. These winter squash, in this case is Canada crookneck squash, is a really good food item. But as you can see, we've just completed our squash harvest, and we've got a couple here that they're really not, there's nothing wrong with them, but they're not at a state that we are likely going to use them. So those are going to get cut up and put into this. As are a summer squash, which has kind of gone a little bit past its prime, a pepper, which again, a little past its prime, and I'm even going to throw those tomatoes in. Something that's quite, I think, important is garlic of some description. Earlier on in the year, I used a lot of garlic scapes. Even when they had gone a little bit woody, they worked great. But I'm not going to put all this in, but I am going to put some of these garlic bulbs into the mix. You can also use various root vegetables, so I am using carrots, and I'm also using some of our sweet potatoes. So a lot of these are sort of small end bits that came from our sweet potato harvest that we could potentially eat them, but they're already starting to go a little soft because they just, even with the curing, they're not going to keep for long. So using them for animal food of any description is really a good use for them. And I do put a lot of greens into this. So the greens vary a little bit depending on the time of year. Earlier in the year when I started experimenting with this, one thing I used a lot of was actually lamb's quarters, which unfortunately, since we're into October, is no longer available. But kale is an excellent one. I'm going to use dandelions, and this time I'm actually going to mix in some mulberry leaves. And the last ingredient that I have been using, which I know is sometimes controversial, is eggs. And I'll show you how the eggs get incorporated into this at the very end, because basically that's when we do it. So I just want to emphasize here that when you're feeding fish that are more or less herbivores or eat mostly plant matter, there's a lot of things you can find in your garden or around your garden that can be used in this. So the first part of this process, and the first piece of equipment I need to use, is a steamer. This is a smaller one. I don't know exactly how big it is. I really like this size kind of from a batch perspective, but I'm basically going to cram this full of the various vegetables and what have you that you saw over there, and put it on to steam for a while. Now there is sort of different trains of thought on cooking your food versus not cooking it for when you're feeding fish. Honestly, I'm finding this is an excellent way to process it. So as I mentioned, I am cutting the squash up a bit because it's a bit tougher than some of what we're putting in here, and to just throw whole squash in is not likely going to work. But when it comes to things like the carrots, this doesn't have to be an exact science, because all you're trying to do is speed up the cooking process a bit. And when I come to the sweet potatoes, I'm just going to put these in basically whole, because the skin and everything is completely fine. They have been... So at this point, I'm going to get these larger ingredients, these root vegetables and squash, steaming first because they'll take a little longer. I'm going to get the garlic prepped to put that in because that will also take longer, and then come back and add the greens. So the last part for the cooking process is in the water below the vegetables that are being steamed. I've been adding eggs, and I basically poach the eggs in the sort of nutrient-rich water that's come out of the steamer. This is something we have that's quite readily available, and it's been working pretty well so far. Now, I typically put 3 eggs for one of these batches. That just seems to work out well. If you were feeding something that needed a little bit more of a protein level, you might change accordingly, and there are other options absolutely that you could use at this step. So one other thing that I do add to this is frozen green peas. So I usually do it later on. I'm going to add them now. As you probably kind of noticed with this whole process, it's not exactly an exact science. So you can kind of be as liberal or not as you want with the various ingredients, and you can substitute all sorts of things. So the next step in this whole process is to take our steamed vegetables and poached eggs and put them in a food processor and grind them into essentially a puree. So I usually start by taking out the egg. I don't care if I get a little bit of liquid. Doesn't look super appealing, but it actually doesn't smell that bad. It almost smells like something you could eat yourself. And you'll see the sweet potatoes have kind of gone to mush, as has the squash, etc. That's exactly what you want to see. So I'm going to go ahead and blend this first round up before I add more to it. And we'll bring you back when it's all mixed. Well, we now have some really nice looking brown mush. that we've got to work with. Now technically, once it cools down, you can feed it at this consistency. I've done a little bit of trials with it. The problem is, the fish like it, the problem is it's messy. So the final step, or second last step I guess, not final, is to take this mush and put it on a sheet that you would use for making like fruit leathers in a dehydrator. And we're basically just going to dehydrate it exactly the same as what you would do to make fruit leather, except in this case it's fish food. All you're doing is kind of spreading it to about the same consistency across the board. And when these are filled, we will pop them in the dehydrator. So there we have our 2 dehydrator trays full of fish food mush, ready to go in the dehydrator. We still have quite a bit left in here. Probably, if I had to guess from looking at it, at least 1 more tray. But we only have 2 of the fruit leather trays. So I'm going to scrape this out of here and put it in the fridge until these 2 batches are fully dehydrated. But you can keep it in the fridge for quite a while. Okay, so we are on to the next step here. The fish food concoction has been in the dehydrator for about 24 hours, give or take. And I'm going to turn this off here and show you what we've got. So there is our dehydrated vegetable mush fish food. So the next step, once we get to this stage, is to use our handy dandy little grinder that we now realize is a indispensable tool. This is just a little coffee grinder. It's small, so what I'm going to do is break some of this up into a little bit more manageable pieces to go in here, and then I'll sort of show you what comes out as we sift it, because I think this is an interesting step. So I'm going to at this point talk about one sort of elephant in the room here. Is I'm sure anybody who's watching this up to this point has seen that we managed to get all the ingredients basically for free, whether it was sort of otherwise waste produce out of the garden, or normal produce out of the garden, or weeds, etc. But there's processing required. We've had to cook it and use electricity. We've had to dehydrate it, and in this case we've used electricity, although there are ways to reduce that dependency. And now we're going to grind it up. And I think the point I want to emphasize here is that any food for any animal, whether it's fish, chickens, doesn't matter, that you're buying as a pellet has gone through this process. So even though we still have the energy input, any animal feed requires energy to produce it, unless the animal can go get it itself. So we're just bringing the production of this closer to home, for lack of a better way to put it. And we're basically using tools that we have otherwise for human food. So it's not like if you're growing your own food, we're not buying anything special specifically for this. So I just wanted to mention that, because there's lots more topics on that potentially to come. So all I'm really doing here is breaking it into chunks, like I said, that this particular grinder can handle a bit more. I'm not breaking it right up into the final form, but when it comes straight out of the dehydrator, it's a little big for the equipment that we have. If you had a bigger grinder, potentially it would work. Now we have done this in a food processor, and it does work. However, we find you end up processing it multiple times, where the coffee grinder seems to grind most of it up on the first try, and we have less that we have to run through it, which is kind of why we've got this as a preference. So as I'm going through this, I want to show really quickly why I'm running it through the sieve. So I put my fine stuff in there that's been ground. Kind of actually doesn't look super unappealing. Doesn't smell bad either. I shake it, and you're left with some larger size pellets. Now some of the biggest ones there I'll pick out by hand, but essentially what this does is it gives me 2 sort of particle sizes, so I can feed this to larger fish, i.e. like the larger goldfish. So one batch and I get fish food for sort of two different sizes of fish. Well, the next step is basically to store this or put it into something to keep for later. And what I've been doing, and I've been collecting these for quite a few years, but just using little fish food containers. Each one of these holds 45 grams or so. And these are all ones right now, so these are all fine, the more powdered version, along with that one. And then I've got a medium one. So I've already made what's sitting here, plus I'm going to estimate about 4 more bottles worth because I've obviously been feeding it over the summer. And each one of these containers retails for about $6 to $7 Canadian. So when you actually think about it, that's a fairly big savings, and I just keep stockpiling or adding to the stockpile as we go. Now, what I often will do as well, because the ingredients aren't always identical when I make this, because it's sort of whatever's on hand as far as vegetables go, I will take some of the already made food, add it to this, kind of mix it together so that I'm not getting, for example, this had quite a bit of sweet potato in it, whereas some of the earlier versions had a lot more of the lamb's quarters. I mean, I'm not getting too far ahead of myself, so it's pretty dry and it's fairly shelf stable for at least the length of time that I'm probably going to be storing it. So I'm pretty comfortable doing that. So I'm going to go ahead and dump a few of these back into this and then start bottling it up. So in typical hickory craft fashion, I wanted to test and see how much I actually was producing here. And even though the containers are supposed to hold 45 grams net weight, turns out when I'm refilling these, I'm getting 73 grams of net weight. So now that it's all sort of jarred up, we did some really crude math here, and judging in the size of these versus what you would pay for the 45 grams in the store, there's in the ballpark of $100 of fish food sitting here that we basically created from otherwise free items. So kind of recapping this a little bit, it's a bit of an odd homesteading video, and it's not intended to be prescriptive per se, because as you've probably guessed from this whole process, there's a lot of flexibility. We're making food, I'm making food that's more suited towards fish that are more or less herbivores, and I'm making it in such a fashion that it feeds fairly small fish. But proof of concept here, you could do something similar yourself, even if you were raising something like tilapia, etc. And there's a lot of flexibility on what you put into it, how much you grind it down, etc. And I'm sure there are lots of ways to lessen the energy cost as well, depending on what you have available to you. If you can dehydrate it using solar, for example, or you don't need to grind it into smaller chunks, etc. All food for thought. But this is a really good starting point in my mind, and the reason why we put this into a homesteading type video is because no matter what you're feeding, if you're feeding these sort of pelleted diets, the principle is very, very similar, but the scale up is different. So in the case of these smaller fish, as I said, we've got $100 or more worth of value in fish food sitting on the table here that we made from completely free items that we just happen to have around the homestead. That's pretty impressive. So whether you're raising fish for a specific purpose, or whether you're just raising fish for fun, or to eradicate mosquitoes from your rain barrels, etc., you could really turn this into a dirt cheap enterprise.